Welcome to the May 2022 CIECAST, Data Sharing in the Collision Industry and its Unintended Consequences. I'm Paul Berry, Executive Director for CIECA. The Collision Industry Electronic Commerce Association, or CIECA, develops and promotes electronic communication standards that allow the collision industry to be more efficient. We also provide webinars like this one to help educate both members and non-members on trends that impact systems, processes, and the exchange of data across the industry. Joining me today is Pete Tagliapietra, Managing Director of DATATOUCH. Pete is well known to many in the industry as the founder of NewGen IT and for active participation in CIECA, CIC, and other industry events. So thank you, Pete, for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, as we start the webinar, I want to remind you that there is no verbal communication between the participants and the presenter. If you have questions during the webinar, please type them in the question panel on the webinar screen, and we'll answer them, as many of them as possible, at the end of the presentation. So Pete, you and I have been around this industry for a while. We both remember the day when estimates were written by hand, and then when the computers first came into the industry. We've seen the technology go from basic electronic estimates to today, where artificial intelligence can, in some cases, write a complete estimate from just photographs. And from a data and a process standpoint, we've come a long way. But one issue has remained a concern throughout the years, and it's as big a concern today as ever, and that's information privacy. Now, you know and communicate with a lot of people in the industry. What are you hearing about this topic when you talk to people today?
Paul, the technology has moved forward so quickly, and standards have helped facilitate that. And we'll get into it this morning, but one of the things that hasn't happened is data security, specifically around the vehicle owner or the customer's name, address, phone number, license plate number, etc. So that has become prolific in the industry, and government agencies are now paying attention, especially over the last 12 to 24 months. So it's becoming it's become an increasingly noted topic in the industry, particularly at the Collision Industry Conference and other forums, and how the industry is going to deal with this going forward.
Great. So thank you for that introduction, and I'll turn it over to you now to present your information.
As we begin to the audience this morning, I want to reaffirm what Paul indicated, and that is obviously it can't be interactive where I would provide some information and you can ask a question, but we would really encourage you to type the question in. So at the end of the session, we will do our best between Paul and myself to answer as many questions as we have time for. So keep that in mind as I go through this information, and then Paul is an interactive part of that this morning, and I've asked him to join in because of his knowledge and experience. So with that, we'll begin. First of all, I think it's important that we sort of give the audience a historical overview of all about the CIECA EMS standard and what its original objectives were and what the intent was, going all the way back to April of 1994 when that standard was released. Next, please, Paul. It's really germane to the conversation this morning that original EMS standard was merely designed to allow body shops to import P-page logic estimate data into their body shop management system of choice. So between Autotex, CCC, and Mitchell, that standard evolved to help body shops facilitate where they didn't have to rekey the information into the management system. Next, please, Paul. It was an important piece here is it was designed for internal shop use only. The EMS standard was never intended to be secure or intended to be used externally for e-commerce purposes. Next, please. So the design of it, and as the EMS standard evolved, well, security was talked about. It never actually occurred, and it was ultimately replaced by the BMS standard. But Pandora's box was opened, and EMS standards today is so entrenched in the industry with information and information sharing. Next, please. So we in the industry clearly recognized the EMS standard as an excellent external e-commerce tool, and it certainly has become that. It's now widely used throughout the industry, and there's very few people in this industry that don't understand the EMS or what it means as far as information sharing, as well as e-commerce capabilities and how it's facilitated that. Next, please. So, in fact, as we saw it evolve, what we saw was several startup companies that built their business around the EMS standard. That involved claim processing, that involved integration with industry stakeholders, and equally important, it evolved with data mining and reporting purposes. So the value of the data through this cycle became very, very important and valuable in the industry. And that data today is widely used for numerous different purposes. And it all comes from that original estimate that was primarily written by collision repair shops and also insurance companies and their agents. To facilitate the e-commerce, the ActiveX controls and data pumps became prolific with shop computer systems. And this is another important point. In order for a shop to upload an estimate outside of an estimating system provider, controls were developed that were installed on the body shop's computer systems to help facilitate, quite frankly, seamlessly and automatically, that EMS export routine being grabbed by the data pump and then shared wherever it was directed to be shared. Next, please. It's important to note here that once a data pump is installed on a shop's computer systems, it can and probably will copy every estimate indefinitely until it's uninstalled. Well, what does that really mean? Well, what that really means is if a shop has a trading partner that they're doing business with, any trading partner, a parts supplier or a claims processing agent, if the shop switches and no longer uses that resource or that stakeholder, if that data pump is not installed, it will continue to send data indefinitely to the recipient, especially if the shop doesn't know that the data pump hasn't been uninstalled and they lose sight of that. We see that as a very key issue here as to what's going on currently. Next, please. With the value of the data, and I touched on this earlier in the conversation, it's often referred to as the newfound gold. That's not my phrase. That phrase has been bantered around in the industry, and I picked up on it. But it's really created significant opportunities to compile and aggregate, or aggregate and compile information, and then be able to sell that information to a lot of entities out there that are looking for better ways to manage and run their businesses. And that all happens through this EMS export routine. Next, please. So most people think about data and how it's being used in the collision repair industry primarily for historical vehicle reporting. But I can assure our audience today it goes way beyond that. And we'll talk about that a little bit in the upcoming slides. So an example of that, the new EV vehicle manufacturers, and I made a point of this at the last CIC meeting, billions are invested in designing and developing new EV vehicles. And the best way for competition to get a better understanding on those EV vehicles is to be able to acquire repair estimate information and understand what parts are being replaced, where those vehicles might be susceptible to repairs, whether it be collision and or mechanical. And you can imagine, I hope our audience can imagine the value of that information in moving forward when a competing country or company wants to develop an electronic vehicle. Next, please, Paul. It's a misnomer for shops to believe that third-party providers can successfully manage personal identification information, commonly referred to as PII, P-I-I, and repair data. And where it gets really complicated is when a shop uploads an estimate and it goes to an information provider, and then that information provider sends it out to an integration partner, they in essence lose control and lose the security that they provide around that data. And I would ask that our audience keep that in mind. So there's no surefire way of really managing the data security successfully unless it happens right at the very beginning when the shop writes that estimate. Next, please, Paul. So this illustration is a very high-level view of what's actually happening. And the reason we put this together, it really came out of the last CIC meeting, where in a panel discussion, it came clear to me that the audience really doesn't understand how an EMS estimate can get from a shop's computer out to a third-party entity that they have no knowledge or agreement with over that data being shared. So if you look to the left of the screen to our audience, that collision shop creates that estimate, they calculate it and save it, and in some cases, it automatically gets exported via the EMS standard. And it can go down two different paths. Oftentimes, more often than not, it's uploaded to the estimating provider so it can be returned to the insurance company. Well, in that scenario, if it's uploaded back to the insurance company, the estimating provider oftentimes reaches out to third-party entities, industry stakeholders, whether that be an alternative part search or a new part search, or it goes to a business management system, or they seek repair information, any number of different opportunities where those integrations now have become a commonplace. And the second path, which can also occur on the same estimate or separately, is the shop attaches that EMS data via an ActiveX control. Such a scenario was the case at NewGen IT. One of the principals there, or I was one of the principals there at the time, and we installed ActiveX controls, and the purpose was to allow that shop to attach the estimate, to upload into the NewGen IT portal, and then be analyzed and then forwarded on to the insurance company. And we, like many other IT providers, would go out to third parties that we were integrated with for alternative parts or any number of different purposes to satisfy the needs of that insurance company on that claim. On that same track, you also have data pumps. So if the shop has an agreement to share information with an entity, they install a data pump, and that pump automatically grabs a copy of that EMS export and forwards it on behind the scenes where the shop doesn't have any direct interaction with that data pump. It just takes a copy of the estimate and sends it forward. That is quite commonplace in the industry, and we'll talk about the number of data pumps that are out there as we get further into the discussion this morning. So what we have here is a snip of some of the ways information is shared, whether it be a parts search database, a parts procurement provider, a third-party claims processor, the body shop management system, or a dealer management system, repair information from a collision repair database, or customer satisfaction are just a few of the examples where data pumps and ActiveX controls are used today. And that information ends up being used in vehicle history reports, parts pricing and parts frequency replacement for analysis for marketing purposes or strategic direction on what parts get manufactured and on what price, vehicle repairability from a competitive standpoint. When manufacturers are looking at different models, how does their model stack up with repairability to another model? and vehicle owner demographics. So in Orange County, California, for example, primarily what is the vehicle, or what vehicles are most probably being owned and driven and in accidents in Orange County or San Diego or Missoula, Montana. That information is all readily available now and is being used widely in our industry. I hope that this visual was beneficial to our audience, Paul. And if we get any questions on it, we can revert back to it at the end of our session.
You bet.
Next, please. So, Paul, I've got one more slide here, and then I think you step in. Am I correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. So the unintended consequences here that EMS has brought us to over the last 28 years, and it happened many, many years ago, the whole information sharing scenario actually has started to occur in the mid to late 90s. So this is nothing new. It's just that personal identification information has now grown to an issue where it's being identified by states. One state that I live in, California, has rather strict personal identification regulations that are now written for businesses, and business owners now need to start paying attention to those regulations. Next, please. So data is being shared across multiple industries without any vehicle owner or shop knowledge and consent. And as we move forward in our industry in the future, that is going to become a very salient issue. Next, please. State regulations on personal identification information are coming into play. I happen to mention the state of California. Well, I can tell our audience today that also applies in the state of Virginia. I know that I don't know what the outcome was, but I know Ohio was active in personal identification information security, and there will be many others that follow that we will become aware of as we move forward here into 22 and 23. Next, please. We can't simply ignore the potential liabilities by not protecting personal information. It's a hot topic in our industry for those of us that are paying attention to it. It needs to be dealt with, and I believe to the benefit of the industry, like anything else, it will be dealt with. It's just going to take time to do that. Admittedly, with the EMS standard, Pandora's box has been opened. We're not going to be able to close that. It's going to take time to transition away from the EMS standard to get data security where it needs to be for the benefit of our vehicle owners, our customers, as well as our businesses. Next, please. Paul, I'm going to turn this over to you. You're the subject matter expert here on this particular topic, so I'm passing the baton to you for this one.
Thanks, Pete. The reality is data privacy, information privacy are concerns, but the reality is businesses have to exchange information to do business. Body shops need to buy parts. They need, there's salvage, rental car, there's all kinds of players in the collision ecosystem, and the need to exchange information is real and it's necessary to the efficient operation of the industry. And that's why CIECA was formed. And as Pete mentioned, the EMS was the first standard developed by EMS, and that was in 1994. And nobody expected, what was going to happen. The EMS, as Pete also mentioned, was developed for internal purposes only, for internal to the body shop, to take data from the estimating system to the shop management system. There was never a grand vision that the EMS would then be shared across the industry as has happened. And CIECA realized early on that that was a concern, and that gave rise to the BMS standard, which I'm going to talk about more in a minute. But there are a couple of terms I want to talk about for a minute because they do seem to cause a lot of confusion within the industry. And the first one is the term data security. you hear this term and people say, well, we've got a data security problem. Data security, you can think of that really more like you think of home security. It's really about keeping the bad guys out. So when a company is thinking about data security, it's the physical and logical security to prevent unwanted access to their systems and to their data, to your routers, firewalls, VPNs, passwords, antivirus software, those kinds of things. And every business has a responsibility to protect their own data and to implement their own data security. Now, CICA and CICA standards really have no bearing in this notion of data security. It's just it's something that each business needs to manage on their own. The next topic is information privacy, and Pete, this is really more what you've been talking about. But again, information privacy is really each business's responsibility to manage for themselves. Information privacy isn't a single thing. It's really the composite policies and procedures that each business puts in place to protect their information. It may be as simple as having a password policy that says, two employees can't share passwords, which is a real common problem with small businesses. You have a disgruntled employee who leaves the business, and now they've got the passwords to the systems at the company. Every business needs to develop a set of controls designed to ensure information is adequately protected and only shared appropriately. A lot of this information privacy programs revolve around employee training, revolve around password policies, system access, system sharing procedures. Larger companies, publicly traded companies, are subject to Sarbanes-Oxley, and they typically have to be certified to show that they have these controls in place to control access to data. Companies that process credit cards or other personally identifiable information will get SOC certifications, SOC 1, SOC 2, or SOC 3 certifications. Larger companies typically have this kind of information privacy pretty well in hand. Unfortunately, it doesn't scale down all that well across the industry. Now, there are companies that offer these services to businesses, but it's kind of a broad view of who are you doing business with, what information are you giving them, do your employees know what they can share and what they can't share. And so it's a broad topic, but it's something every business needs to be aware of. Now, from a CICA standpoint, we've never really had any ability to control data security and a company's information privacy programs. That's each business's own area. But when CICA began to realize the EMS was being shared broadly, they began to focus on this concept of data segmentation. We know that we need to share information from company to company with your trading partners, but the question is, what data do you need to share? And it was this concept of data segmentation where you identify what data is necessary for a particular job and only share that data. And that's what gave rise to the BMS standards. And our next generation that we're working on today, the CICA API standards, or the CAPAS standards as we call them, are really built with this concept of data segmentation built in. If we don't need to share a customer's personally identifiable information to order parts, then we shouldn't. We only need to send the VIN number and the year, make, model, kind of trim package kind of information. The parts distributor doesn't need to know the address of the vehicle owner. There's just a lot of data that can be shared in the EMS that is not shared in a BMS or in the CAPAS standards. So we think it's really important the industry understand the distinction between these terms because they do get misused a lot. And I think it's important that we try to be more precise on this as an industry. But as we look at how we work with our trading partners, ask the question, are we sharing EMS with people that don't need it? Should we be sharing BMS or the CAPAS standards data so that we're only sharing the data that is appropriate? So that's really the background on that, Pete. And so I'll turn it back over to you.
As we look forward on how to address the issue There's obviously a lot of work to be done. When you're standing on the basement floor, however, there's nowhere to go but up. And I think pretty much that's where the collision repair industry is with data security or protecting information, personal identification information, excuse me. I think we'd all agree that, or most of us would agree that awareness to this issue has become a well-recognized concern, and it's certainly not just going to fade away. It's going to be there and it's going to stay with us until we deal with the issue at on an industry level as a whole. Next, please, Paul. The conclusion that I have, and there's always room for debate, but for me, it goes without saying that the author of the estimate and or the repairer must take responsibility to secure the information from being misappropriated. And that clearly falls into the hands of the body shop or the collision repair organization that has control of that estimate after an assignment is received from an insurance company and what happens with it after that. Next, please. We need a solution, to Paul's point, that's offered to shops that deals with segmentation, and I'll use his last bullet point here, that deletes the personal identification information before sharing that estimate with practically everybody and controls the repair data based upon the trading partner need. An example that I would use is if you're a CSI provider, you certainly don't need any repair information content. You need the contact information of the individual to complete the customer satisfaction index reporting. If you're a parts provider, you don't need the entire estimate. You just need the repair lines of the parts that are being replaced or that are you're asking that stakeholder to search for and or procure from. So those are a couple of simple examples. It goes way beyond this. To mitigate the amount of information that's shared is critical here as we move forward. Last bullet, please, Paul. There is light at the end of the tunnel here that enough visibility has been brought to this problem that shops will have a solution that meets the regulatory requirements and be able to control the data flow. And we believe that will be available in 2022. So it's going to take a long time for the industry to get their arms around this. I think we all recognize that. But like any other problem that the industry has faced, I'm confident, Paul's confident, that it will be addressed and dealt with. It will become important to understand that ultimately, I believe we need to move away from the EMS standard and onto a more sophisticated standard, a standard that took personal identification information into consideration and will be much easier for collision repair shops to manage and feel comfortable that they're not giving their data away to anybody and everybody who simply wants to take it. We have to get to the point in the industry where a shop will be able to identify the number of data pumps that are running on their computer systems and allow them to validate which data pumps should be running and what information should be shared. And Paul, with that, if there are questions, I believe that was the last slide. We're happy to take them if our audience wants information on any of the topics or any of the discussion points that we made this morning.
Thanks, Pete. Stacy Phillips, CIECAST Marketing Director, has been monitoring the webinar for questions. Stacy, have we received any questions for Pete?
Yes, thank you. Our first question is the information you shared about the number of cars being repaired in Orange County, for example, is also available from the state insurance commissioner. And how do you know EMS data is being used for that?
I'm not saying that the EMS data is the exclusive provider of that information. I just know from looking at records and demographic reporting that we provided at NewGen IT, we were able to disseminate that information and provide it to interested parties. So to answer the question, do I know what's happening? Yes, I do. I do know what's happening. How many entities are actually providing it? I don't have that answer, but I know it's there. And I don't believe you'll be able to get that information from a government agency.
Thank you, Pete. Our next question is, do you have a cheat sheet that defines what data is considered PII?
Yes, all but one. We know that personal identification information includes name, address, phone number, license plate number. The debate goes over the VIN on whether or not the VIN is personal identification information or not. I'm not the authority on that. I have a personal opinion on whether or not the VIN is personal identification information, but anything that can identify the vehicle owner or the customer, I would have to consider it to be PII.
Thank you, Pete. How can shops tell if they have data pumps on their machines?
They can't, not yet, but that's coming. And to our audience this morning, I believe that there will be auditing software available before the end of the year that will be able to detect and advise the shop how many data pumps they're running and who's operating those data pumps on their computer systems.
Great. How long do you think it will take our industry to completely get rid of EMS and move to a more secure process?
Oh my goodness.
And this is something that Paul might be able to share information about our new standards as well.
As entrenched as EMS is in the industry today, okay, it's going to take several years. And a lot of it is going to have to be driven by the businesses that support and use EMS. For example, if an entity that provides that format, EMS, and decides to no longer support it, okay, that certainly will help the transition. My take on it, and Paul, you can weigh in here, is this is going to be a several-year transition. Paul, do you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I agree with you, Pete. I don't think that it's. I don't see any, magic carpet or silver bullet that's going to solve the problem. It's going to take businesses choosing to work with partners that will protect their PII. It's going to take, a push from the shop side of the industry to demand it. Honestly. We have the BMS, which has now been around for quite a number of years and is very broadly used, particularly by large companies for what I call enterprise type integrations. Those are your server to server integrations. There's millions of transactions a year that are done through the BMS. So the BMS is widely used, but there are still a lot of transactions that take place, particularly with smaller companies, with startups, where the shops are exporting data directly to that company or through a data pump, and those are still in the EMS. So I think it's really going to be the shops are going to have to push their business partners to say, I won't do business with you unless you're doing it through BMS. And CIECA, unfortunately, I wish we could wave a magic wand and control that, but we can't tell the industry what to do. Our goal is to build standards that support better information privacy practices and make it available to the industry. And our new CAPAS standards are providing a JSON-based option instead of the XML, which was in the BMS. It's a more current technology. So we're trying to make the tools available to the industry to use better information protections. But I'm with you, Pete. I think it's going to take a while.
I think to further that question and answer, it goes back to the shops being able to detect, the immediate need is for shops to be able to detect what data pumps and what ActiveX controls are running on their computer systems, and validate the legitimate ones and disable the illegitimate ones. I believe that is critical to beginning to get our arms around the issue. And Stacy, back to you if there's more questions.
Yes, thank you. Our next question also comes with a compliment. Nice presentation. And our question is, do you see this as being addressed through IPs globally or locally at the shops?
Both. I'm sorry, it's a one-word answer.
Okay.
If I understand the question correctly, this is a North American issue, United States and Canada. I don't believe it's a European issue. I don't have that knowledge, quite frankly, but it's clearly an issue for North America, and it is, if you want to consider that global, it is a global issue.
Okay, thank you. What should a business do today to stop unauthorized extraction and redistribution of PII data?
Well, first of all, if you're still faxing estimates, please mark out the owner's name and address. Okay? By all means, please, please, please do that before you fax that estimate anywhere. Take that personal information off the estimate. The stakeholder doesn't need it and shouldn't have it. In reference to what else they can do is they want to make sure that they know who the information or what information, what entities they're actually connecting with as far as that estimate, that EMS estimate data being shared. I mean, there's tons of legitimate reasons here why it's being shared, and shops don't have, as far as I know, a good answer for the shop to control that personal identification information. I know that some of the estimating providers have services available to help control that, but as soon as they send it out to a third-party integration partner, they lose that control, to the best of my knowledge. So I believe the best thing that the industry can hope for is to understand the fact that this is being worked on, it is being addressed, and solutions will become available to help the shops secure their information.
Thank you. Our next question is a two-part question. Is there a way to restrict or mark PII as optional before pushing it to the data pumps? And then are there any documents or standards that define what qualifies as PII in shop data?
There are documents that qualify PII, and those can be published if the person asking the question doesn't have those, but it can be researched easily on the internet. And Stacy, ask me the second part of the question again. I apologize.
No, that's fine. I'm sorry. I should have asked separately. Are there any documents or standards that define what qualifies as PII in shop data?
Yes, there are, and that can be researched and readily available. And if the person asking the question can't get that information, they should be able to contact Paul at CIECA, and we'll make sure they get it.
Great, thank you. So the next question is, how does a shop know if it's equipped to handle the data is being sent out is okay, and all the business processes the shop needs to use? So how do they know if they're equipped and if the data being sent out is okay and safe?
The dilemma we have, if I understand the question correctly, is the shop doesn't have the environment, the application to help them systematically manage that. So unless they go in and manually delete the pie from the estimate, it's going to go in many different places. And I don't think it's reasonable to expect the shop to do that on a day-to-day estimate-to-estimate basis. We have to apply technology to the process. And the good news on that is I do believe that is forthcoming.
That's great news. Thank you. Those are all the questions we have for now, and this is being recorded as well if anyone would like to share the recording with their team.
Thank you. And Pete, thank you very much for joining us today. We appreciate you taking time and sharing this information. So thank you very much.
Paul, you're welcome. It's a pleasure to have the opportunity to speak to such a large group. And thank you for the invitation on this topic. I believe it's very important to the industry, and it's something that we're faced with and we have to deal with. Thank you again.
Thank you. Before we wrap up, I'd like to remind attendees this presentation has been recorded and will be available later today at CIECA.com. I'd invite you to check CIECA.com for a schedule of future broadcasts and to watch recordings of past webinars. Links are available under the CIECAST tab at the top of the website. Also, CIECA has partnered with the Automotive Management Institute. Attendees of this webinar are eligible to receive credit towards a professional designation from AMI after taking a short quiz on its website. A link will be sent to all attendees. And please follow CIECA's social media platforms to stay up to date on upcoming events on CIECA News. This concludes today's webinar. Thank you.